Blessed Sanguinala. Sanguinala isn't just a celebration of hope, it's a remembrance of a sacrifice. And 10,000 years after the angel fell, humanity faces its darkest night. Bow burned, hive fleets encircled the sons of Sanguinius, and then a miracle arrived. Not from the heavens, but from the forges of a genius, who refused to let the angel's legacy of perfecting the gene seed die. Today we're exploring how the creation of the Primaris Marines is woven into the very spirit of Sanguinala, rebirth, purity of purpose, and the eternal flame of Sanguinius' bloodline. First, let's explore what a Primaris Marine is. At the dawn of the Indomitus Crusade, the Primarch Guilliman directed Belisarius' call to unleash the hundreds of thousands of Primaris Space Marines inside his gene laboratories on Mars. These awoken Astartes were to be the elite backbone of the Crusade, tasked with pacifying the crumbling Imperium and reminding the galaxy of the true might of humanity. But before the Crusade could depart the Sol System, Guilliman divided his Primaris Marines into two distinct forces. The first was made up of entirely new Primaris chapters, created in what became known as the Ultima Founding, while the remaining Primaris Marines were gathered together into 9 armies the size and strength of the massive Astarte legions of the Great Crusade era. The earliest form of these enhanced Astarte warriors are known as the Awoken. They were the first Primaris Space Marines to march forth from beneath the sands of Mars. They lay dormant in the darkness within the confines of Archmagos Belisarius' cause laboratories on the Red Planet for nearly 10,000 years. These soldiers were unleashed from their stasis vats by order of the Primarch Guilliman. His intention was to use the Awoken as the backbone for the Indomitus Crusade. What makes these warriors unique from the rest of the Primaris Marines is the process in which they attained all of their knowledge of war and their martial discipline. They were psychologically and physically indoctrinated within the boundaries of Call's laboratory, forcing them to inherit all of their battlefield knowledge from a lab and to focus on a single strategic goal. Some were intercessors, some aggressors, and almost all specialized only in that one area of combat. Because of this, the Awoken failed to possess the strategic flexibility of the Firstborn Marines, whose tactics were honed in on the field of battle. They were still able to immediately take up arms in the front lines of battle and to perform phenomenally against the many threats facing the Crusade, but the grueling progression of adapting to this new environment cost them lives. These Awoken, or sometimes referred to as the Martian Primaris Marines, went on to fight on as Grey Shields, cooperating on missions with the Firstborn Marines of the chapters that were encountered as the Crusade progressed. The Grey Shields were a truly one-of-a-kind Space Marine force, and as a whole, the entire force was officially known as the Unnumbered Sons of the Primarchs. The first thing that made them unique is their organization. You see, the armies were legion size and could wage war on a much grander scale when compared to the successor chapters of the first founding legions. This afforded the entire military force the capacity to cover entire sectors or subsectors under one unified army. They were further divided into chapter-sized units that more or less followed the dictates of the Codex Astarte, but were highly specialized for very specific battlefield roles. They lacked the diversity of the Firstborn Marines that were tried and tested on the field of battle. And because of this, the Unnumbered Sons fought alongside many other Imperial military forces like the Sisters of Battle and the regiments of the Astra Militarum, something that was very uncommon for the Firstborn chapters who were used to operating independently from the rest of the Imperial High Command. Another very rare attribute about the Grey Shields is that they fought in mixed gene line formations, meaning that a unit of Grey Shields possessed battle brothers with different gene seed heritage. They all supposedly belonged to one of the 9 Loyalist Primarchs, but mixing all of these battle brothers could have been a way to hide the battle brothers who descended from the traitor lineage. Nevertheless, what you would find in the Unnumbered Sons units is a Salamander fighting alongside a Raven Guard, all led by a Blood Angel captain. This mixing of gene lines gave the Unnumbered Sons a unique perspective from various genetic backgrounds, but because a lot of the character and demeanor of a battle brother is influenced by their genetic heritage, the mixture created one-of-a-kind unit cohesion. The aggressive nature and close combat tendencies of a Space Wolf could complement the level-headed nature of an Imperial Fist, however it could also complicate the dynamic. Guilliman hoped that the mixing of the troops would also prevent the inter-chapter disputes that plagued the legions of the Great Crusade era. As far as records show, this did prove to be a good solution, and their cooperation was very similar to Deathwatch kill teams. And another very unique aspect of the Grey Shields was that they didn't exist for very long. All 9 armies were dispersed at the end of the Indomitus Crusade, and no battle brother carried on the Grey Shield badge of a pale grey chevron on their shoulder blades. Whenever a crusade encountered embattled chapters of Firstborn Astartes, the Lord Commander Guilliman ordered members of the unnumbered sons of the same gene line to become a replacement for the depleted chapter's losses. At other times, Guilliman simply created a whole new chapter of Primaris Marines from the unnumbered sons formations to meet a given need, such as the defense of a strategically important Imperial world. However, these new chapters were not mixed, and composed of only one single Primarch's lineage, like the Firstborn counterparts. And by the time of the Battle of Raucus at the very end of the Indomitus Crusade, only 20,000 Primaris Astartes remained within the depleted ranks of the Unnumbered Sons. The fight to defeat the Chaos forces emanating from that ancient warp rift in the wilderness space known as the Pit of Raucus proved to be the last campaign of the Unnumbered Sons, for at its successful conclusion, Guilliman brought the Indomitus Crusade to an end and disbanded the remaining Grey Shield armies as he moved on to intervene in the plague wars of Ultramar. The remaining Unnumbered Sons were dispersed to the already established Space Marine chapters, where they would take the lessons they had learned fighting alongside Astartes of different lineages into units descended only from their own Primarchs. Now let's talk about how you could use this established lore on the Grey Shields to create your very own homebrew chapter with multiple gene lines. And this is something that I get asked a lot. Could one chapter have more than one gene seed? The answer is no, unless you use the Grey Shields as a way to bend the lore so that one single chapter has former Grey Shields who are passing down their inherited characteristics, morphing the homebrew chapter into a hybrid successor chapter with battle brothers from different Primarchs. For example, if Guilliman created a new Primaris Marine chapter to defend a certain region of space, it's most likely that the battle brothers tasked with protecting that region are the same Space Marines that pacified the region. And instead of breaking apart units, the entire Unnumbered Sons force simply becomes one chapter and is designated a single gene seed for new recruits going forward, but the original Space Marines are a mixture of Marines. This also gives you the opportunity to hide Primaris Marines with the lineage of a traitor Primarch into a new homebrew loyalist chapter. The true origins of their gene seed is only known to the chapter and the Torchbearers. Now if we reel back from the potential of homebrew lore and go back to the lore of the Indomitus Crusade, let's talk about how the Grey Shields integrated with the regular Firstborn chapters. And because of their Vat-forged upbringing, the Awoken struggled to integrate with the Firstborn brothers. Their adoption of their gene chapter's combat doctrines forced these Primaris Marines to break the deep-seated combat styles psycho-indoctrinated into their minds. Tension and conflict is rare, but did occur between the Awoken and their brethren because of this stress. Now during the first wave of the Ultima founding, the Awoken proved invaluable reinforcements for their parent chapter. Yet in the ongoing wars for humanity's survival in this new era, a single influx of fresh strength would not be enough. This is why, along with warriors, the Indomitus Crusade fleets included Adeptus Mechanicus Genitor acolytes, who integrated themselves within each already existing chapter's Apothecarion. It was these acolytes and their arcane machines that enabled the Astartes to recruit and train new Primaris Space Marines within their existing chapters. In every fortress monastery and upon every fleet-based chapter's flagship, the machineries of a grim and bloody future were installed and awoken. From these engines of Genesis came the waves of Primaris initiates. They were referred to as the Indoctrinated, Primaris Marines born on the soil of their home chapter. Now, not every chapter of Firstborn Marines welcomed these new arrivals. The Adeptus Mechanicus is a controlling organization known to bend morality in the pursuit of power. Chapters such as the Dark Angels and the Space Wolves are notoriously insular of culture, and some guard dark secrets that they would risk everything to keep out of the manipulative tech priest's hands. However, none could deny that being able to recruit and train fresh waves of Primaris Space Marines provided the Astartes with a long-term, sustainable wellspring of martial mind. So the process began. Some chapters implanted all of their aspirants with the full suit of the Primaris organs, while others gifted only a portion of their novitiates in this fashion, leaving the others to develop as Firstborn Astartes. These newly conditioned battle brothers benefited not only from the strength of the Primaris enhancements, but also from the tactical versatility imparted by a full and rounded progression through the ranks, coupled with all of the cultural and spiritual indoctrination required to properly initiate the neophytes into the chapter. And thus the Indoctrinated found a place as a new breed of Primaris Marines. Now, no true son of the Primarchs could look upon the might of the new Primaris brothers and not wish to take up the mantle of power for themselves. They sought this agonizing hypothesis not for personal glory, but because no true Space Marine could refuse greater strength, resilience, and weaponry with which to protect the Imperium and slaughter their many foes. The warriors of the Ultima Founding had joined their parent chapter. The machineries developed by Belisarius Cawl had provided those chapters with waves of new Primaris recruits who had integrated into every single level of the chapter's organization. For the Primaris-only chapters, this was an end to the matter. They stood proudly as defenders of the Imperium, recruiting from their own conquered fiefdoms and forging their own roll of honor as the years passed. Yet for those chapters who had come before, questions remained to be answered. Could a firstborn Marine, who had not been created Primaris, undergo the necessary gene therapies and evasive surgeries required to elevate him to the status of a Primaris? Could he gain the benefits of the enhanced Primaris physique and access the potent new war gear that was theirs to wield? In short, could they cross the so-called Rubicon Primaris to become yet greater living weapons in the Emperor's service, or would attempts to do so simply waste priceless Astartes lives at a time when the Imperium could ill afford to sacrifice their greatest defenders? Records differ as to who was the first Space Marine to take this perilous leap of faith. Some say it was Marnius Calgar of the Ultramarines, or that it was Corsaro Khan, the White Scar's ferocious master of the hunt, who first made this painful transition. Other chapters made their own claims, or else lamented the tragic loss of those who tried and failed to ascend. Yet despite the losses suffered and the unspeakable agonies of undertaking the Primaris ascension, more battle brothers crossed the Rubicon with every passing day. These Primaris Marines became known as the Ascended.
But let's see what that actually looked like with Marnius Calgar crossing the Rubicon.
The induction of the Primaris Marines into the Adeptus Astartes was not an easy process by any means. The chapters of the Space Marines were traditionalists, and some were conservative in the extreme, having upheld the same warrior traditions for thousands of Terran years. Of course, the express command of Guilliman as the Lord Commander of the Imperium eased the transition into a new era. For the Ultramarines and the vast majority of their successor chapters, the word of the risen Primarch was good enough, and many chapters welcomed the Primaris Battle Brothers gladly, but there were those especially secretive or willful chapters who saw the incorporation of the Primaris Marines into their ranks as a dilution of their gene stock and a betrayal of their long-held culture. Some amongst the Adeptus Astartes suspected that the Primaris Marines, being stronger, more durable, and closer in blood to their Primarchs, represented the eventual destruction of the traditional Astarte. No amount of reasoning, of pointing out that what the Primaris offered in raw abilities they lacked in experience and versatility, could save the spiritual wound dealt by the sight of these newcomers wearing their chapter's heraldry. It was the Sons of Dorn, the Imperial 5th Space Marine chapter, and many of their successors, whom first questioned the battle prowess of these new Marines. Untested on the field of battle, how could they be trusted to fulfill the duties of the legendary Space Marines without previous engagements? When the time came to show their military might, the Primaris Marines did not disappoint. To the Dark Angels and their successor chapters, the thought of allowing Primaris Marines into the sacred and secretive ranks of the First Legion and unraveling the truths of the unforgiven and the fallen was a thought quickly turned down. To the Flesh Terrors chapter, a proud and notorious Blood Angel successor chapter, weak and dying as they were, refused to see the Primaris Marines as the true sons of Sanguinius. It wasn't until the honored and holy members of the Adeptus Custodes who illuminated the false precautions and conservative nonsense that was spreading to these chapters. The Primaris Marines were a gift from the God Emperor himself, and to deny them into their ranks was to deny the will of the Emperor. Few chapters turned down their assistance after that. Nevertheless, the Primaris Marines of the Ultima Founding found their way into the brotherhoods that the aspirants of yesteryear had given everything they had to join. Questions heavy with the weight of mankind's destiny hung in the air. Would the Primaris Marines ultimately render the traditional Space Marines extinct? Would the identity of each chapter's homeworld be diluted with so many thousands of new recruits sourced from the stasis vaults of Mars? And was it possible for a Space Marine to be transformed into a Primaris, inheriting the benefits of the Adeptus Mechanicus archaeal science, while retaining their personality and experiences? This last question had been raised by almost every Adeptus Astartes chapter across the galaxy. It was a query Marnius Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, had asked of Belisarius Cawl himself, and had discussed with those of his fellow chapter masters he was able to meet in person. Debates raged as whether such an act was even possible without having deadly consequences for the recipient, for data that the Archmago's Cawl had already amassed on the subject suggested that there would be a 61.6% failure rate at such a transformation until the process could be perfected, which would take some time. Then there was the moral concern of whether this process should be even attempted at all. The dilemma proved dismissive. There was those who claimed it was the ultimate destiny of the Adeptus Astartes, while for the other quarters, some whispers of rejection, even mutiny at the prospect. The lords of the Ultramarines came to the conclusion that to ease the transition from centuries of imperial traditions to a new order, the theoretical of the raging debate needed to be put to the test. It was Marnius Calgar who stepped forward as the first test subject from the ranks of his storied chapter. It was a process he did not survive, though like his Primarch before him, he was to rise from the threshold of death once more. The operation to transform Calgar from a traditional Space Marine into a Primaris Marine was conducted in an auto-sterilized medvault, thick with the tang of contraceptic and crowded with elaborate medical servitors. The room was dominated by the great marble slab at its center, artfully carved with runals to protect the copious streams of blood that would result from this procedure. The surgery was to be extensive and agonizing, a fact Marnius knew well from Call's tediously thorough description of the process. A Primaris Marine is gifted 3 new gene seed organs, in addition to the 19 originally grafted, soldered, and chemically implanted into the aspirant Space Marine. These are the Magnificat, which is buried deep in the brain to stimulate growth and to intensify other organ functions, the Belisarian Furnace, which releases a burst of hypersteroids and cortical stimulants when a mortal blow is dealt so that the Primaris Marine may fight on, and the sinewed coils, cable-like lengths of durasteel that encase every tendon and sinew in a metallic sheath that gives tremendous resilience and strength. During the implantation of the Primaris organs, Marnius Calgar was cut open from crown to heel. His ribcage was cracked apart, and at the climax of the procedure, his physiology suppressed to the point that his life slipped away. Choirs of cyber-shurums sang blissful, overlapping requiems, swaying as they might guide Calgar's soul back to his body. The corpse lay on the marble slab, its flesh wide open to the air, for what seemed to those watching like ages. 10 long solar minutes ticked past, then 20. Skull-faced surgeons clicked and muttered and stabbed at the chapter master's tortured flesh. Those around the periphery of the apothecarium theater held their breath in dread. Then, with his wound stitched closed by thousands of jabbing needles, and his mighty heart electrified to a beat once more, the newly forged Marnius Calgar was brought back to life. He broke his bonds with a strangulant, blood-fleckered roar, stumbling to life as Belisarian Furnace brought him to instant battle readiness. Calgar had clawed his way back from beyond the brink of death, and in doing so, he had shown his chapter and all the Space Marines that transformation was possible. The Rubicon Primaris had been crossed, a new path open for the Adeptus Astartes.
Now that we have an understanding of the different types of Primaris Marines and how they got organized into the chapters, let's talk about the biology of the gene seed of a Primaris Marine.
The Primaris Marines possess all 19 gene seed implant organs that have been gifted to their original Astartes brothers, as well as 3 more that only they possess, for a total of 22. These new gifts of Belisarius Cawl's genius further enhance their transhuman status and ability to bring the Emperor's justice to a galaxy shrouded in darkness and despair. The first of the gene seed organs was the Revitalizer, or the Belisarian Furnace. This is a dormant organ that connects to both Astartes' hearts. In time of extreme stress, or should the warrior's body undergo violent, damaging trauma, it expels great bursts of self-synthesized chemicals, a hyper-cocktail that stimulates the biological action of combat stims, while also aiding in the rapid regrowth of tissue, bone, and muscle. The gland then falls dormant again, and takes some time to metabolically build up upon itself, until the next usage. Another gene seed organ is the Magnificat, or the amplifier. In truth, the Magnificat is but half of a true dual-valve immortus gland, or so-called Godmaker, that the Emperor created for his Primarchs. However, Belisarius Caw could only find materials and genetic blueprints to build the dextrophic lobe, the right half of the immortus gland, while plans for the Centaurus, the left half, that could complete the original super organ, had been wholly eradicated from imperial records of the Primaris project. Whether this was done by the Emperor's own hand or by some nefarious source, Caw could not tell. A small, thumbnail-sized lobe that is inserted into the brain's cortex, the Magnificat, secretes hormones that increases the body's growth function, while also intensifying the function of its other transhuman implants, especially those of the Biscopia and the Osmodula. The syncoil, or the steel within, is another Primaris gene seed organ. The Primaris Space Marine sinews are reinforced with durometallic coil cables that can contract with incredible force, magnifying his strength as well as giving his body another layer of defense. A Primaris Space Marine can crush a man's skull in his hand, break flak armor, or even bite through a metal cable, should the need arise.
And finally, I touched on this a lot during 9th edition lore for the Primaris Marines. A big part of that was the Plague Wars, so let's get into that.
During the Plague Wars, a greater danger than any Ultramar had faced in its long and war-torn past infected the realm, and it emerged from the horrors of the Cicatris Maledictum. During the time of the Noctis Aeterna, when the Great Rift first tore open, a terrible rot ravaged the Imperium. Spiritual maladies blighted the souls of the faithless, and the foul emiteric plagues twisted the flesh of all it touched. Plague cults arose from amongst the desperate, diseased populations, who offered praise and sacrifice to the great chaos god Nurgle, if he would but end their suffering and spare their lives. Festering bands of the plague god's revolting demons spilled through holes in reality. They consume worlds in an unnatural sickness and misery. At the necrotic heart of these outbreaks was a trio of star systems to the galactic northeast of Ultramar. As they fell into utter ruin, these scourge stars became strongholds of Nurgle's strength, gangrenous legions in the flesh of reality, from which the servants of Nurgle launched one brutal attack after another. All was as Mortarion had planned it. The Primarch of the Death Guard Traitor Legion and the demonically empowered Arch-Champion of Nurgle. This ancient, corrupted warrior lord had long coveted the realm of his brother, Gilliman, and as the warp-tainted tendrils of the Cicatris Maledictum turned reality to madness, the Death Lord's chances to seize this glittering prize had at last arrived. Mortarion would seize the vibrant bounty of Ultramar, its teeming populations, its natural harsh beauties, and its plentiful supplies. He would imbue them with Nurgle's blessings. Flesh and crops alike would rot, sickness would spread like wildfire, worlds would curdle beneath droning storm clouds of flies beyond number, and the splendor of Ultramar would feed the rampant expansion of Nurgle's garden. By the time Mortarion and the Death Guard were done, Ultramar would be a corpse of its former self, putrid and teeming with the infectious life that Grandfather Nurgle so adores. So began the greatest invasion that the realm of Ultramar had ever known. When the isolating darkness of the Noctis Aeterna had reached its peak, the scourge stars vomited huge fleets of rust-pocketed warships towards Ultramar, surging forth upon the boiling tides of the warp. Their moldering hulls bore the dreaded triple skull emblem of the Death Guard, the old Legion symbol twisted into a foul echo of Nurgle's own mark. Within their bloated bellies, the Rot-Hulks and tentacled pox-cruisers carried vast hosts of warriors ready to invade and despoil the purity of the Ultramarines' realm. Like parasites lurking in the guts of monstrous beasts, Mortarion's soldiers sat in wait through the madness of the warp towards their destination. Rank upon rank of Death Guards stood ready to spread plague and despair. Lumbering demon engines strained at their rusting chains, groaning and bellowing in their desire to break free and begin the slaughter. Teeming hordes of disease-ridden cultists, poxwalkers, and mutant filth screamed praise and droned gurgling hymns to the Plague God, even as his revolting blessings squirmed through their flesh. Rot-bloated titans and renegade knights loomed dark and menacing, ready for the assault to begin. It was a vast and terrifying invasion fleet, and it brought with it sickness, decay, and misery on an unimaginable scale. Amongst the many worlds of Ultramar, those of the 3 planet systems have been the most bountiful, a trio of agri-worlds, Quintarin, Tarantis, and Masali. Predominantly rocky deserts, the 3 planets were unusual for agri-worlds in that their endless crop rotations were grown within huge fortified habdomes. During the period of time known as the Blackness, after the fall of Cadia, the world of Masali was shifted a few degrees off its orbital track by shuddering empiric forces. Whether by chance or some darker design, Masali underwent dramatic climatological change as it was battered by wrenching grav waves and racing superstorms. By the time the planet's trial subsided, Masali's human population had been all but exterminated, or at least evacuated. Yet a new world had been created that was even more fertile than before. Gone were the stony expanses and sand-blasted wastes, replaced by endless tracts of nutrition-rich soils, across which fell warming sunlight and soft cooling rains. From within the shattered structures of the agridomes came clouds of drifting seeds and spores, the crops continuing to propagate as they always had, until whole continents were carpeted in swaying oceans of bountiful flora. Some believe this was a blessing from the Emperor, others that this was Nurgle's first surpassingly subtle attack upon Masali. Considering what came after, it is hard to contest either theory. The people of Ultramar were quick and industrious to seize this new paradise, and reaping its produce to feed the ongoing war efforts of their empire. Vast agri-fortresses rose amongst the golden macro fields, city-sized strongholds that were settlements, gun-studded castles, and crop-processing hubs all in one. Fleets of barges descended into low orbit every single day, greedily devouring the food bales ferried up from the planet below and bearing them away to the waiting worlds of Ultramar. The first sign that anything was wrong came when a strange blight struck the crops of the northern polar steppes. Afflicted plants ripened at an unnatural rate, bloating far beyond what was natural and turning rotten and sour. Finally, the squirming, bruise-colored crops bursted open, spilling clouds of droning flies into the air. Surf laborers reported strange whispers and stirring shadows wherever the clouds of flies droned through the air, and a spree of insanity and violent murder struck the work camps and harvester factorums in the region. The blight spread through the crop oceans like wildfire, and no attempt to stop its advance proved successful. Day by day, the skies over the polar steppes darkened with the smoke of burning crops and the ever-growing swarms of flies. Alarmed by the worsening crisis, and conscious of a wave of nightmares and dark omens sweeping his world, Masali's planetary governor ordered his astropathic choir to send a distress call out into the void. A former soldier who fought on Talisar against the Iron Warriors before the Blackness, Governor Titus was canny enough to suspect that a far greater horror was on its way. Titus's grim predictions were proven true when on the 77th day of the blight, the vast clouds of flies blanketing the northern sky turned as one and swept together. They formed a single raging storm of bloated black bodies and buzzing wings, a cyclonic storm of flies 100 miles wide. The insect vortex span faster and faster, its droning roar carrying across the steppes to infect the souls of all who heard it. From within the thundering storm, there rose a dolorous tolling of bells and wailing of damned souls. One by one, warriors of the Death Guard strode from the fly storm, their hulking forms looming through the veil of unreality to stand amidst Masali's rotting fields. War was immediate and savage, with more warriors advancing from the fly swarm vortex by the moment. Whole colonies of traitor legionnaires formed up and trudged out to battle. With them flew bloated demon engines, while at their heels came rusted, lumbering battle tanks and larger, more terrifying war machines. Shambling herds of poxwalkers flowed around them, their malignant moans infecting those who heard them and spreading their spiritual sickness through the Masalian populace with frightening speed. Armored regiments of Ultramar's defense auxilia mobilized to fight back, roaring out in glorious columns of speeding tanks to stop the invasion before it could truly begin. Macro fields burned and withered as gunfire went back and forth, and tanks churned rich soil to bloody pus-licked mud. Explosions flashed across fly-blown horizons day and night, but ultimately the defense auxilia could do little to slow the Death Guard advance. One regiment after another was crushed, the corpse of their crews rising soon after, with rictus grins to join the shambling hordes of poxwalkers. The first agri-fortress, Diomedes, fell shortly after, its crushing gates smashed down and its defenders blasted into oblivion by advancing Chaos Space Marines. It seemed as if though nothing could halt the unstoppable march of Mortarion's festering sons. After Diomedes, the Death Guard advance split into 3 separate forces, led by mighty champions of Nurgle. Each flowed toward one of Masali's largest agri-fortresses, drowning settlements and blackening the land like unrushing rivers of corruption. Masali's capital city was the recently rebuilt agri-fortress of Kadropolis, a fortified amalgam of hive city, fortress, and processing cathedral dedicated to the Emperor and his 17 saints of the harvest. It was situated in a natural valley between 2 low ranges of mountains, and was protected by concentric rings of fortifications, batteries, and auxilia bastions. Here was local Governor Titus's palace, the primary command sanctum of Masali's Adeptus Ministorum, and the world's astropathic chambers, to name but a few irreplaceable military assets. If Kadropolis fell, the heart would be torn from Masali's defenses, allowing the Death Guard to overwhelm the world's survivors at will. Charged with crushing the Enclave was Golgoth the Afflictor, Lord of Contingent and commander of the Tainted Sons Victorium. Golgoth was an unsubtle warrior to say the least, and one who took gruesome pleasure in his work. The Lord of Contingent considered his orders, issued by no less than Mortarion himself, as a glorious opportunity to bring Nurgle's blessings to the benighted corpse worshippers of his world. He would tear open the sterile vessel of Masali's capital city, and fill it to overflowing with Nurgle's blessings. Lord Golgoth's initial attacks were resoundingly successful. Filth-encrusted siege titans blasted the Basilica Fortis into rubble, opening the mouth of the valley to infection and attack. Clouds of plague flies swept across the northern ramparts, blinding and suffocating defense auxilia, while Death Guard siege tanks moved into position and shelled their outer defenses to ruin. A heaving mass of 50,000 poxwalkers surged across the city's outer minefields, overrunning the Bastion Centaurum and the Bastion Angelic before they were finally exterminated by desperate auxilia counterattacks. Meanwhile, plagues and parasites infected the city itself in ever greater numbers, leaving corpses rotting in the streets and priests running mad as they preached the end of all things. Only 7 days after his siege began, Lord Golgoth stood poised before Kadropolis' Aquilian gates. The Tainted Sons were poised, ready to advance down Transitway Eagle Alpha and break the city wide open. It was at this crucial moment that aid finally arrived. Sweeping into orbit over the beset Agri world came strike cruiser Guilliman's Vengeance. Aboard this fast-moving warship was Captain Sevastus Akron and his strike force of Primaris Space Marines. Warriors of the Ultramarine 2nd Company, Akron and his battle brothers had been dispatched as soon as the governor's astropathic distress cries reached Macragge. The fickle tides of the warp had delayed Strike Force Akron until this desperate juncture, yet the scions of Guilliman were superb strategists and decisive warriors. Rather than balk at the desperate situation below, Akron immediately set to analyze where his forces could strike to turn the tides of war. One Death Guard Victorium appeared to be mirrored in a vast tank battle, while a second was still digging slime-choked trenchwork around the outer defenses of the agri-fortress of Mortengol. Clearly, the Victorium poised to overrun Chondropolis presented the most immediate danger to the Imperial war efforts. With this target determined, Captain Akron ordered Guilliman's Vengeance into low orbit and readied his forces for an immediate combat drop. Intercessor squads jogged across the ship's embarkment decks, bolt rifles held at ready as they clambered aboard waiting Storm Raven gunships or strapped into the grav harness of a drop pod. Hellblaster squads gathered and knelt in prayer to the machine spirit of their volatile weapons. Inceptor squads stood patiently as arming servitors machined their heavy jump packs into place under the watchful eyes of a hunched tech priest. As each assault specialist pack was affixed and sanctified, they strode into position beneath the maglock deployment rigs that would swing them out into space before firing them into Masali's upper atmosphere. Cocooned within the ceramite and adamantium immensity of Mark X Gravis armor, Captain Akron strode up the rank of his Storm Raven gunship. If he could halt the Death Guard force before Kadropolis and turn back the foe with a glorious victory, then they would buy time for fresh reinforcements to reach the war. For Masali, vowed Akron, the Imperial counterattack began here.
And that's the lore to the creation of the Primaris Marines. I hope you guys are enjoying Sanguinala. I don't want to completely focus on the Blood Angels. I want this to be a Space Marine and Imperium kind of perspective, because Sanguinala, although is Blood Angels related, has to do with the entirety of hope within the grimdark future of Warhammer 40K. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll talk tomorrow. This is Gershwin with One Mind Syndicate, signing out.
Oh, if you could put my freedom first.